Sometime back in the 1980s, I was walking near the University of Chicago, near Rockefeller Chapel, which is a huge Gothic building. Indeed, the whole campus of the University of Chicago transports one back to medieval Europe with gargoyles peering out from the huge stone walls. And among this ancient architecture, I saw this curious little home. It had a plaque on it, and it said the Roby House. And it said Frank Lloyd Wright, 1907. And I figured that must have been the date that the architect was born, because surely a house this modern could not have been built in 1907. It seems so out of place next to the other buildings, so horizontal amongst the towering limestone cathedrals. Eventually, I learned that Wright was born in 1867, and he had indeed built the house in 1907. And at the time of its construction, it was in harmony with the Midway, which was a mile-long field of grass left over from the Columbian Exposition. So it had all this long length and flatness. 20 years later, after he built this house in harmony with the Midway, Rockefeller Chapel was completed in 1928, looking back to the old cathedrals of Notre Dame. Wright was building a distinctly American modern style in the 20th century, while other architects were looking back for the classics. The Roby House was what Wright called his prairie-style homes. He followed his mother's advice to stay close to the earth. He emphasized the horizontal lines, and even the bricks on the Roby House are twice as long and half as high as conventional bricks. Wendy Murphy writes, important characteristics of the prairie style include large sweeping overhangs and balconies which pull interior spaces outside, pools of water, horizontal exterior surfaces made of plaster stone, trimmed in wood, and long horizontal ribbons of windows which wrap around corners to give unobstructed view of nature. The prairie-style homes built by Wright between 1901 and 1937 differed from traditional floor plans of the day. The designs were so revolutionary that the neighbors often scorned the houses and their owners, because these were revolutionary. You ask a child to draw a house, and you generally get a pentagram, a box with a pointy top. And these prairie-style homes are as flat as the prairie that they're upon. And that ability to see beauty in the flatness of the surroundings. He grew up in southern Wisconsin, which is kind of the Illinois part of Wisconsin, also very flat and Indiana-like and Illinois-like. And you have this kind of sense of foreverness, of the land just going on forever. And many people, calling this country flyover country, would even say that it's boring. And me, coming from Michigan with a little bit more glacier action, a little bit more rolling hills, and then more recently living in North Carolina where they have actual mountains, when I came to Indiana, I said, really going to have to search for beauty. But Wright, growing up here, said these houses need to be in harmony with the beauty that is here, and there's this beauty in the flatness. And you bring the outdoors in and the indoors out. And he had this vision of the buildings being part of the land rather than a box placed on top of it. A few summers after I saw the Roby house, I had the opportunity to work on the Ward Willets house, which is a prairie-style home built in 1902. And while we were taking the shingles off and replacing the roof, the overhanging eaves were drooping. Our architect told us that Wright had engineered the roof correctly except for one thing. He forgot to calculate for snow weight. A pretty big mistake for northern Illinois. And so the architect that was supervising the project used lessons from the Roby house roof built 5 years later to reconstruct the roof of the Willets house. And taking the shingles off was painstaking. Usually to take shingles off a roof, one takes a pitchfork and flings them down to the ground. A roof can be completed in a day or two. But in this case, each window was considered to be worth $10,000. They were in his conventional style with leaded glass with little gold leaf designs. The owner of the house had actually been told, tear the house down and sell the windows. But he wanted to fix the house. So we had to pry every shingle up by hand and carefully walk over to a chute and slide them down to a dumpster. So taking the shingles off the roof took several months. And once I was on the edge of an overhanging eave and wrestling with a stubborn shingle, and it flung me off the edge. And I am so glad that Frank had followed the advice of his mother of building close to the ground, because I was unharmed except for my pride. Frank Lloyd Wright was a Unitarian, and his spirituality influenced his architecture. He built the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House in Madison, Wisconsin. It was built in 1950, about 40 years after his prairie-style home. And it sits atop a small hill, and so it's a little bit different than the prairie-style because the roof line of the church follows the hill. And it juts forward and upward as if it's growing out of the hill itself. Wright believed no house should ever be built on a hill or on anything. It should be of the hill, belonging to it. And they should live together, each happier for the other. When Wright dropped out of college in Madison to work in Chicago, he was supervised by his uncle, Jenkin Lloyd Jones, who was the minister of All Souls Church in Chicago. And Jenkin Lloyd Jones was not only the minister of this church in Chicago, he was the executive of the district, the Western Conference, Western of the late 19th century, that ran all the way to Iowa and Illinois. And this was a conference that very much embraced the teachings of Emerson and the Transcendentalists, and they were called the Unity Men, who held free the banner of freedom, fellowship, and character and religion. Wright would later say, "I believe in God, only I spell it nature." And this was a very radical movement. At one point, all the ministers in Iowa were women. And one of the women ministers in Iowa and her partner, that was an open partner, went to be a minister at a church that I attended in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Which I have a couple of my friends from Kenosha here, a church that ordained me back in the 90s, that Florence Buck, who lived openly with her partner and was a minister in 1908 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so this is a real radical form of religion, so radical that the more traditional Unitarians in Boston were really kind of concerned about what was happening out west with Jenkin Lloyd Jones. So this is the type of radicalism that Frank Lloyd Wright grew up in. And he took it into his architecture and this Emersonian philosophy. And when one ever reads Emerson, one never gets the sense from reading Emerson that Emerson was humble. And one will never get the sense from reading Frank Lloyd Wright that Frank Lloyd Wright was humble. It's that sense of tap into what is godlike in yourself and express it and just go with it, run with it. And Wright wrote, "Nature is my manifestation of God. I go to nature every day for inspiration. In a day's work, I will follow in building the principles which nature has used in this domain." So it was that sense that he was on a mission from God, and being a transcendentalist, it was the God that lived in himself as reflected in nature. But Wright did not always have the luxury of building in nature. Robert Greene writes, "The site for the Larkin building in Buffalo was ugly, and so turning the building inward made sense. Likewise, the site for the Johnson Wax building in Racine, Wisconsin, is not beautiful, and though the structure is also turned inward, and so the inside is made to resemble nature with these large lily pad-like structures and beams." And also in New York, the Guggenheim Museum is almost closed to the outdoors and is to focus on the art somewhat, because Frank Lloyd Wright was so convinced of the beauty of this spiraling ramp of art, and legend has it that when somebody complained that maybe some of the pieces of art might not fit in his design, he said, "Well, they'll have to be cut," because he felt that much commitment to the beauty of his own artistic vision. So there's this sense that buildings are more than just storage compartments for our lives. That buildings have a mystical quality to them. I have preached at the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. And this is one of those buildings that is closed off to the outside because it's just in a kind of a bland neighborhood that was already built up by the time that he had, built there. And so from the outside, it looks pretty much like two cement blocks just sitting there, kind of stylized, but not much more. But you get in, and you really get the sense of the mantra of form follows function. Here, we're sitting in a church. I'm on a raised platform. That really shows my authority over you. You're all sitting back. I'm preaching to you. And there's this real sense that this is the focal point and this is what it's all about. At the Unity Temple, the seats surround the central space. There's 450 people can sit there. Some are below, which is, if I would never preach there in a short skirt. Some are at the level, and then there's some are a little bit up, but no matter where you are, the people are close. I mean, they're right there. And that the space, the farthest that anybody is away from you is probably about the third row here. And and so everybody is just there around you, and you feel this community. And it's like, oh, we are together in this space. It's a different way of church. It's a different way of how authority is. It's, even though it's square, it feels more organic and circular than this, raised pulpit preaching down to the crowd. And so it was an interesting place to preach, because it really changed the nature of how the preaching was. The church that I was in North Carolina was built by a LLoyd Wright fan, and so it looks like a prairie-style home with the long overhanging eaves. And the fellowship hall where we preach, it's actually is set up horizontally, where it's as wide this way as it is long. The pulpit isn't as raised, and it isn't more in the round. And the windows are in back, so if the sermon's too boring, you can look at nature, which is probably the true message anyway. So, the thing about Wright, and I think what it speaks to our religion, is that our whole lives can be religious. People can often tease Unitarian Universalists about, oh, they can believe in anything, or they believe in nothing, but there's a part of the Transcendentalist movement of looking for the holy in everything and taking everything seriously enough to say it matters. And think about the spaces you occupy. In what way are they functional? And what ways are they beautiful? And what ways does that form follow function in a way that becomes beautiful? What do you want from your home or your workplace or the place where you worship? Why does it feel different to shop at a mall or a Walmart or a small boutique store? Our life is so caught up in the things that we move from place to place that we forget to consider the spaces between things, how we make distinction between inside and outside, and we don't consider how they interact. Do our buildings harmonize with nature, or do they separate us or protect us from nature? If you could change one thing about your home, what would it be? In one way, architecture is very tangible. It's a hard science. It's the engineering of cement and steel and wood and glass. But then, again, it's ethereal. It asks the question, what is beauty? The question is mystical, as asking what is holy. Each individual has their own notion. Wright said that An idea is salvation by imagination. Salvation by imagination. What a remarkable idea. Think of how different that is from so many religious traditions that encourage salvation by conformity. Salvation by imagination is salvation by nonconformity, to take a look at other possibilities. If we limit ourselves to duplicating cathedrals of the past, we limit the possibilities. So, use your imagination. How do you plan to beautify the space around you and within you? Wright wrote, God is the great mysterious motivator of what we call nature. And it has been said often by philosophers that nature is the will of God. And I prefer to say that nature is the only body of God that we will ever see. And if we wish to know the truth concerning anything, we will find it in the nature of that thing. And so to look at anything, we get a tree, a chair, and say, what is the truth of that? What is the truth of that? Your life is never without meaning, because there is always something to examine, to improve, to make better. I conclude with this quote about human beings that at least gives me some solace that though it appears that LLoyd Wright didn't like people very much, he still liked humanity as a concept at times. Human beings can be beautiful. If they are not beautiful, it is entirely their own fault. It is what they do to themselves that makes them ugly. The longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes. If you foolishly ignore beauty, you will soon find yourself without it. Your life will be impoverished. But if you invest in beauty, it will remain with you all the days of your life. Last week, I spent a week visiting my daughter in North Carolina. And I can say without reservation that North Carolina is a pretty state. And it is prettier than Indiana. And Michigan, where I grew up, is prettier than Indiana. But since I've moved to Indiana, I have really embraced the looking for beauty. The sense of looking and finding beauty. Just this past Friday, I was early for lunch with our seniors that live at Westminster. And so what am I going to do for a half an hour? And so I went to Columbia Park. And there's a woods that's about as big as our property in the middle of Columbia Park behind the ball fields there. And I kind of walked into it. There was a path. And someone said, is this the path less traveled? And I said, I doubt it, because there's people in there all the time, but a lot of people don't even know this woods exists, and if you Google it, you'll see it. This is like this little patch of woods that you wouldn't even know it's there. But what I've noticed about Indiana, that anything that is not planted over in corn and soybeans is probably interesting. It's some land that has some water in it, some moisture, maybe even a little bit of texture, maybe even a few odd things growing in there. And in the middle of this woods, in the middle of our little suburban paradise, there was this little ditch of yellow flowers. That beauty is there. And so one could disparage of the never-ending corn and soybeans of our existence here in Indiana. But that beauty is here. And one can look at our lives and all the mundane tasks we have to do, from laundry to grocery shopping to whatever we do for a living, and email and all these things. But if we focus on beauty and creating beauty, we are in touch with what is holy and what is the nature of truth.